It's my privilege to have the opportunity to kick off the 9th Annual Words Festival, and we're excited to bring a full week of activity. We have 40 national and regional authors, artists, and thinkers that are going to join us. This has become something of an annual tradition for us, is to introduce some of the events that are going to take place, and I'd like to introduce you to some of the authors that you have the chance to see. So this is a broad view of the menu of what's going to happen over the coming weeks at the festival. So over the course of the festival, we have talks on the role of storytelling in Anishinaabe law, delivered by an award-winning legal scholar, John Burroughs. We have a conversation between Omar and Sala, as Janice had just queued up, which will do a deep dive, I hope, into Omar's fiction and journalism. The 50th anniversary of the Writer-in-Residence program at Western University. Did you know it's the longest running Writer-in-Residence program in Canada? So there'll be a 50th anniversary of that. Yes, absolutely. We'll visit with Vanessa Brown, the cold case sleuth, and a detective, Michael Arntfield, exploring the darker history of unsolved homicide in the region. We will have the James Rainey Memorial Lecture with Stan Dragland, which will be read by Terry Griggs. After Stan's tragic passing during the summer, he was planned to come and give the lecture and passed away in August. So we'll be doing something in Stan's memory very soon, but we have his lecture, the last lecture to be delivered in his words that will come on Sunday. We have 10 poets who will read poems they've composed to confront the violence in Ukraine. We have a talk on the legacies of Indigenous radio with elders Dan and Mary Lou Smoke. So Dan and Mary Lou Smoke, there's an exhibition of some of their print journalism out in the plinths that are in the space here. They host the longest running Indigenous radio program in Canada, and it's from here in London, Ontario. So we're going to celebrate them and talk about the legacies and importance of Indigenous cinema. We have 4 Western researchers, from engineers to literary scholars, who are going to talk about how we're confronting climate change. We have Juno Award-winning singer Lorraine Clausen performing with London legend Frank Ridsdale. That will be here on Saturday afternoon. We have the visual art of Anita Kuntz, who has done cover art for The New Yorker, Time, Rolling Stone, joining us to talk about her show that's on at TAP, just recently installed. You might have seen the CBC article about it. Original Sisters is the book that she'll be talking about, which features portraits of women who have changed the world. We have an open mic poetry night here tomorrow night, which will feature the 2022 Poetry Slam champion, Eddie Lardy. And you can contribute to a Words Fest zine and become an instantly published author at the Words Festival with your own work. So we have lots to go. And when we go to mingle, there is up in the pod here, which is the space near the cameras, in the back, there are over 40 local writers who have their books on display. Many of those authors are in the room right now and are putting their work on display, as well as local publishers. So there is something literally for everyone at this festival. But to kick us off tonight, I would like to introduce our panel of 4 stellar authors whom you'll all have a chance to see tomorrow at the festival. And I wanted to have an opportunity to welcome them to the stage to talk to them. And as I introduce you, I'll have you come to the stage. There's a little step here that I might have to just step away from, or you can, up to your comfortability for the authors coming up, there's a little thing here. Just watch your step as you're coming up onto the stage. So, as I introduce, I'll get our authors to come to the stage. Stephen Marche is a novelist and essayist. He is the author of half a dozen books, including The Next Civil War, The Unmade Bed, The Hunger of the Wolf. He has written opinion pieces for essays for The New Yorker, New York Times, The Atlantic, Esquire, The Walrus, and many others. Wayne Johnston is one of Canada's finest writers. Beginning his career as a reporter for the St. John's Daily News, he published his first novel, The Story of Bobby O'Malley, in 1985, with the publication of his breakthrough novel, The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, which some of you might have seen at the Grand Theatre here in London, Ontario. He received critical acclaim for telling the epic story of Newfoundland's complicated history and a fictionalized depiction of Joey Smallwood's contentious efforts to bring Newfoundland kicking and screaming into the 20th century, to use Smallwood's famous phrase. His novels have been nominated and won numerous awards, and his memoir, Baltimore's Mansion, won the Charles Taylor Prize. He's making his third appearance at the Words Festival with his memoir, Jenny's Boy. Madhur Anand, Madhur Anand's debut book of prose, This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, which was actually here at the Words Festival over the pandemic, won the Governor General's Literary Award for nonfiction. Her debut collection of poems, A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes, was a finalist for the Trillium Book Award for poetry and was featured here at Words as well. Her second collection of poems, Parasitic Oscillations, was published to international acclaim and named a top pick for the Spring Poetry by CBC. She's a professor of ecology and sustainability at the University of Guelph, and she actually holds a PhD from Western University in biology too. And Laurie Graham is a writer and editor and publisher of Brick Magazine, which was started by our beloved Stan Dragland, one of his many achievements in this community. Her first book, Rove, was shortlisted for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award for Best First Book of Poetry in Canada. Her second book, Settler Education, was a finalist for Ontario's Trillium Award for Poetry, and her poetry has been shortlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize, won the Thomas Morton Poetry Prize, and appeared in Best Canadian Poetry Anthology. Welcome back, Laurie. Okay. All right. So let's get started. So what I'd like to do is give you a taste of their work. So this is completely, I'm going to be right candid with you. This is to entice all of you to come back and see them tomorrow. So we're going to give some flavor of their work. So I'm going to start with Stephen Marche, whose book, The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, confronts us with the question that the United States, embroiled in tribalism and polarization, is headed towards civil war. An idea that 10 years ago might have seemed like a complete fantasy, but since the election of Donald Trump has become an increasingly prevailing topic of concern and political discussion. We're especially aware of this, of course, because the midterm elections are coming up this very, very, very soon, I think this week. So in the very start of Stephen's book, Stephen, you write, the United States is coming to an end. The question is how? I wonder if you could tell us, how did you come to write this book and how you came to such a breathtaking opening statement?
Well, there were a few things going on at the same time. I was sent by the Walrus to cover the 2016 inauguration. How about now? Yeah, much better. I was sent by the Walrus to cover the 2016 inauguration of Donald Trump. And right around the time I was standing on top of a limousine trying to film the mob with my phone, and somebody lit the car on fire and I had to jump out of the way of the flames, I thought, something's going on in this country. And basically I devoted the next 4 years to try to figure out how. Basically I was sick of being shocked by American politics, and I was sick of being surprised by it. And, the fact that I and everyone I knew and everyone I read kept being sort of shocked and appalled made me think that there must be something that I wasn't seeing and that nobody else was seeing, and that there was some structural problem to this that needed addressing. And so basically I devoted the next 3 or 4 years to crossing America, trying to figure out what that might be.
Right. And as I was preparing to situate this year's festival around the theme of bridging divides, the first chapter of your book, it's called Dispatches, The Battle of the Bridge. You write, the bridge is a symbol of the divide in American political life right now. The bridge would make a perfect symbol, and this is quoting you, for the hard right. Nothing embodies decaying American government more completely than its bridges. In my mind, I have the bridge as a symbol of the civil rights movement with the confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Could you talk about that? How did the bridge come to symbolize such a the divisive forces of American political life right now?
Well, not just America. The bridge at Windsor that got taken over by the Freedom Convoy itself became a symbol for division. I'm a very poor example of bridging divides. Like, I don't think I could be a worse example of that. I mean, my work is really about the divides that seem to me totally intractable and the loathing that is overtaking Americans in their, not just in their political exchanges and their ideological exchanges, but even in their daily lives. I mean, they just cannot stand to be around each other on a very granular level, like on a very human level. And that was kind of the hardest part of the book to write. So, the bridges in America are rotting. There is no attempt to really deal with American infrastructure on any rational level, but that's because government itself is collapsing. I mean, they're barely capable of keeping their debt payments up. So, yeah, like the infrastructure just became a kind of symbol that I used, but it was not. It's more a symbol of a general collapse, if you will.
Right. Wayne, your new book, Jenny's Boy, takes us back to your childhood years growing up in Newfoundland. When I was thinking about how images of infrastructure and transit evoke moments of convergence and divergence, as I just mentioned with Stephen, I thought of a very moving story you tell about how your father, remarking how Newfoundland Railway had been overtaken by the Canadian National Railway, and lamenting that it had been further overtaken by a fleet of cheap buses. You tell the story of how the train for your father evoked a pre-Confederate Newfoundland. And this is to quote you, a strange hybrid of arrival and departure, discovery and abandonment. You remark that your mother would tell you and the kids that you must never ask your father about that first train trip he took in 1948, a trip that you would eventually take together, I think in 1968. Could you talk about that train trip across Newfoundland and why it was so important to you and your father?
Yeah, I guess. I'm trying to remember it. Yeah, my dad was one of the, I don't know how averse you are or versed you are in Newfoundland history, but Newfoundland is not a maritime province. Newfoundland is an Atlantic province. It's a very important distinction to remember because what it means is that Newfoundland became part of Canada almost 100 years after the next last province to become part of Canada. So we have only been a part of Canada, for a fairly short period of time. And before that, we were something like a country. We were technically a dominion and sort of loathingly a colony. But most people thought of themselves and in fact fashioned a flag after the idea of Newfoundland as an independent country. So my dad and his dad lived in a place in Newfoundland, on the southern shore of Newfoundland, called Ferryland. And Ferryland was the anti-Confederate capital of Newfoundland. It's a very small place. Like, it sounds like it couldn't possibly be the capital of anything. St. John's is the capital of Newfoundland, and St. John's was really the capital of anti-Confederacy. But if you're talking about where the sort of heartstrings were, it was in Ferryland. My father was, my grandfather, Charlie, was a blacksmith. And he was also, as they love to use the word as if it was a military thing, he was one of the lieutenants of Peter Cashin who tried to defeat Confederation and cement Newfoundland as an independent country. So that's how my father grew up that way, listening to talk about that kind of thing. And then nobody really believed Confederation was possible until suddenly it was. And the referenda were held in 1946. There were two of them. One resulted in Confederation losing, but Whitehall in England said, well, that's not the result we want, so we're going to have another referendum. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop the low person on the totem pole, and we're going to have another referendum. And we're going to have another one after that until we get the result we want. Does that sound familiar? So that's what they did. They had another referendum. And in that referendum, my grandfather, Charlie, was, really, really fervently opposed and worked as a politician against Confederation. Exactly what my father felt about it is the crux of Baltimore's mansion. But when my mother talked about don't mention the train was a symbol of pre-Confederate Newfoundland. It crossed the island in exactly 24 hours, assuming that nothing went wrong, meaning assuming there was no bad weather, which is another way of saying that it never crossed the island in 24 hours. Never, ever made it across in 24 hours. Not even in the summer, actually, because forest fires used to burn up the track. When on referendum night, just imagine now that you're back and Quebec is having its famous referendum that was so close, when there was the blue line and the red line across the bottom of the screen. And for a long time, it looked like Quebec was going to win. But a portion of Quebec, their votes had not come in yet. And that was the eastern townships, where more Anglophones lived than Francophones. A similar thing happened in Newfoundland. All night long, Newfoundlanders gathered around their radios, listening to the results coming in. Everybody was drinking because independence took a big early lead. So people started going out on the road celebrating, a victory that they assumed was about to take place. The vote kept getting closer and closer and closer, and my grandfather, Charlie, drinking more and more, getting more and more nervous about what the outcome would be, until finally the votes from Labrador came in. And what had been a tiny, tiny margin for independence became a tiny, tiny margin for joining Canada. And my grandfather, very famously and sadly on that night, got up from the radio. They were one of the few houses that actually had a radio. So the place was full of strangers and people listening. He got up and went out to the blacksmith's forge and lit up the forge. I don't know if you've ever seen a blacksmith's forge, but it's quite elaborate. And, pulled on the bellows to get the whole thing roaring. And then he took out his hammer and started banging it on the anvil, to no purpose. He wasn't trying to make anything. He was just sort of doing this in protest. The sound kept going for a long time, and the people left the house. And Nan, my grandmother, heard the sound of the, knocking on the anvil. And she went to bed, and she could still hear it. And about 6 o'clock in the morning, what woke her was silence. The sound of the hammer had stopped beating. And she went out to the forge, and she found her husband, my grandfather, dead on the floor of the forge on the night that Newfoundland had lost its chance to be an independent nation. Charlie was lying there. He'd had a heart attack. He had the hammer in one hand still. Now, while that happened, my father had gone away to university, and he didn't have enough money to come back home. So he was not able to attend his father's funeral. He hid out in his university residence. Nobody could get him to come out, and it was a an enormous thing between him and his dead dad that he was never able to come home to grieve with the rest of the family. When I came along, my father told a lot of stories about that night and about the referendum. One of the stories he didn't tell, but that I found out just sort of by fluke, is that when my father went away to university, it was assumed everyone in the family was against Confederation. Bad assumption. People didn't say who they were really for. They said they were for Newfoundland's independence, but that might or might not have been true. So Nan looks out the window on the day my father is supposed to leave for college, and she sees that my father and grandfather are fighting. And she can't hear what they're saying, but they're really fighting down on the beach, right near the water at Fairyland. And eventually my father storms off in a huff, and Charlie does the same up towards the house. Jump ahead years later in time, and my father and I are taking the last train ride across Newfoundland that ever occurred. The train was phased out. They gave us notice that if we wanted to take one last ride, we could. And so a bunch of people got on that train. On that train, my father did quite a bit of drinking. There's a fair bit of it in our family, in Newfoundland as well. And on that train ride, after we retired to our berth for the night, my father started telling me, about what could have been, what Newfoundland might have been like, and asked me to look out across, he said, the greatness of this country, he said, and he put his hand across a map, and I remember still hearing it crackling, beneath his hand. But I fell asleep, and later on I woke up. But it wasn't silence I was hearing, it was my father, who was, I thought, most fervent Confederate, talking about my grandfather, who I thought was the second most, or maybe most fervent Confederate. And I realized from the argument my father was reenacting that one of them, in the secrecy of the ballot box, when no one knew, actually voted against Confederation. But I couldn't figure out which one of them it was. My father said to Charlie, in this sort of, as he was drinking and talking to himself, you never should have done that. You never should have done that. You betrayed me. You betrayed me. And Charlie said, no, you were the one who betrayed me. But they never got really into detail, and I was just listening on every word. Years and years and years later, when I wanted to write about Newfoundland, I wrote The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, and that dredged up all this personal stuff. So that's what Baltimore's Mansion was about. And in the writing of that book, I tried to figure out which one of them betrayed the other, but I never do figure it out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, and such a moving story around that train ride with your father. Laurie, I'm going to jump right back to Madhur. You have described the form, rhythm, and movement of your new volume of poetry, Fast Commute, as being a kind of scroll, or one that matches the experience of taking the train or driving on the 401, looking out the window as you were traveling through southwestern Ontario. Roads, railways, rivers, like bridges, become symbols of our disconnection along our fast commute. Could you talk about how you came to write this book and how those images, like the 401, I think of Jack Chambers' 401 as well, thinking about this. How did that come to be?
I was taking a lot of buses, spending a lot of time on the 401. Remember the Greyhound, everybody? It didn't survive the pandemic. There's a lot of Greyhound in this book of mine. I lived in London when I started writing this book. I moved to Kitchener and finished writing the book. So I was on trains and various modes of transportation and found myself writing in scraps, kind of echoing how when you're passing too fast by a scene out the window, you kind of catch it for a couple of seconds and then it's gone. Contextless almost. You do a route after a while and you start kind of getting to know the scenery as it passes. But I found myself wanting to write in this disconnected form to echo the feeling of moving too quickly down the highway, not really getting to sink deeply into an image that you see. I was also inevitably, as I was writing this, seeing how this could possibly be responding or a poetic response to what social media is, to scrolling through a feed. There's something that goes together for me between that kind of travel and that kind of perusal. So that was what the form was doing as I was writing. And sometimes I needed to stop and kind of take some time to look at something more deeply. But I was really interested in what the effect would be if you were to try to scoop up the entirety of your journeying and the disparate images and things you see around you, and see what the result of that would be. I was traveling on the 401, so that meant a lot of perpetual renovation of the land, buying, digging, rebuilding, buying, grazing, rebuilding. So that it ended up being that I was writing a comment or responding to an essential feeling of environmental grief, and so that kind of fragmented telling ended up working really well to really dig deeply and stare deeply at something that was really hard to look at.
Yeah, and I can give an example. White-tailed deer lifts head from alfalfa, aims satellite ears at 6 lanes of paved artery. Humans, each alone, dragging goods encased in them.
That was just outside of Woodstock. Yeah, totally. Stuck in spontaneous gridlock on the 401.
Yeah.
You kind of, instead of looking ahead, you look to the side.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing. Madhur, I've been asking Stephen and Laurie and Wayne about these forces that divide us through figures like the bridge, figures that carve through our geography by highways, by railways. But I want to ask you about lines that divide us, or more specifically, the partition. The partition of India and Pakistan, the idea of partitions, which frames your experimental memoir, This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, winner of the 2020 Governor General's Award. This book opens on partition, the historical division of India and Pakistan, of Hindus and Muslims, of friends and neighbors, of languages, cultures, generations. Your parents lived through the partition before coming to Canada. What drew you to write about the partition, and how you wrestled with and played with this concept of partition in the design of the book?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. So nice to see you all. So let's see. I published my first book of poems in 2015. It's entitled A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes. And that new index was poetry for me. I am a scientist. I had been practicing as a scientist for many, many years before my first book of poetry came out. In fact, I wrote my first poem just at a desk at Western over there. And then after that first book came out, I immediately started to think about writing another book of poetry, and two things sort of happened very close together. That year, my mother had a heart attack, and it was, the first time that I was confronted with her mortality. And, for a child, I think that's it's a big thing. And then the other thing that happened was I came across a title on the internet, just sort of scrolling. I had an infant at the time, and was just scrolling randomly and I came across the title of a book called The Nests and Eggs of Indian Birds. The Nests and Eggs of Indian Birds. And I thought, as soon as I saw the title, I didn't even know what the book, who it was by, when it was written, anything. I thought, my next book of poetry is going to be that. It might even have that exact title. So I ordered it, and when it came, it was a 19th century book of natural history, which at the time was written in a very, poetic style, right? A lot of the natural history done at that time was. And it was a book that described species by species the nests and eggs of Indian birds, but not the birds. And so I found that fascinating. Like, I was just ridiculously mesmerized by this text. I read it. I took it with me everywhere I went. It was on the table, like replacing the Bible, and well, not replacing. I mean, you know what I mean. I just read it and 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 read it for 7 years. Meanwhile, so many things in life unfolded, and then my second book. So I will get to answer your question.
Oh, it's great.
So that was the work that went to my second book of poetry, which is out this year, Parasitic Oscillations. But in the interim, how I got to learning more about partition was through the realization when my mother had a heart attack, when she was on the ICU bed, telling me things that I really knew almost nothing about her life or my father's life. Like, it felt totally ridiculous in the time. Like, I didn't know the name of the village where she was born, and it's my mother, right? It's like not a very far. And so I just realized, oh my God, how can I come to this point in my life with this level of education, with all this stuff, and I just don't know a lot of things. And there's a lot of reasons for not knowing those things. But from that moment on, I decided that I needed to learn more. So I spent a lot of time reading about history, asking them oral history. I spent hours and hours and hours interviewing them, recording their voices. And that turned into my second book, which is sandwiched between these two books of poetry, which was This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart.
Amazing. I have more questions, but I want everybody to have a chance to get a drink, to get some food, and to have the opportunity to talk to our authors. So what I'm going to do is tell you to come see more about all of these topics. Madhur and Laurie will talk about their new books of poetry with the amazing D.A. Lockhart, who's here with us today, right over here. And you can come just back here tomorrow afternoon to hear them read from their new books and to talk to Daniel about their work. You can see Stephen Marche in conversation with CBC London's Rebecca Zandbergen here tomorrow at 1 p.m. They'll be discussing the future of American political life. So definitely come back here at 1 p.m. to hear more about Stephen's work. And you can see Wayne Johnston in conversation with Helen Gregory, the curator of Macintosh Gallery at Western. Helen was here. I'm not sure if Helen's... Oh, there's Helen right up here. That should be absolutely amazing. Join me in offering a warm thanks to our artists. Now let's get a drink, chat with our authors, and check out the Sowesto Book Expo. Thank you very much, everyone.